All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack a really fascinating debate from our source material. We're looking at a deep dive conversation between academics Professor Simon Haynes and Dr. Fiona Mueller, who argue that our education system is undergoing a fundamental and, in their view, very worrying shift. They're asking if modern education has essentially abandoned classical knowledge in favor of activism and managerialism. To set the stage, get this. According to the source material, an alarming 44% of Australians are functionally illiterate based on OECD testing. That's nearly half. The speakers point to this massive statistic as a key indicator of a system they believe is completely failing in its foundational duties, basically leaving students without the core tools they need to actually thrive in society. So this brings us to a really crucial question posed by the speakers. Have our educational institutions stopped teaching students how to think and instead started teaching them what to protest? The guests argue that a heavy focus on political ideology has quietly but effectively replaced the rigorous development of critical thought. To wrap our heads around all of this, we're going to trace the evolution of this crisis, from the ancient philosophy of what education should be, all the way to today's massive university sector. And finally, we'll look at the solution they're putting on the table. Let's kick things off by examining the stark symptoms of what the guests describe as an absolute educational emergency. The sheer scale of the fallout here is honestly pretty striking. The source highlights a massive loss of public confidence. They point out that dropping international literacy scores and severe student disengagement, literally 50,000 students completely detached from the system, are driving parents to vote with their feet. We're seeing mainstream public school enrollments drop to historic lows, which is being offset by an exponential rise in homeschooling and independent classical schools. To figure out where things went off track, the speakers argue we really have to look back at what education was originally designed to achieve in the first place. They point out that the Latin root of the word education, educare, literally means to nourish. The original goal, according to the guests, wasn't just to produce literate robots or utilitarian cogs for a machine. It was meant to deeply nourish the moral, spiritual, aesthetic, and intellectual development of the whole human being. And this brilliantly highlights their core philosophical divide. You see, the guests advocate for what they call inducing students into a shared civilization and a culture of reason. They contrast this directly with the progressive model of education, popularized by thinkers like Rousseau, which assumes all valid ideas and feelings are already innately inside the isolated child, just waiting to be led out. The speakers argue this progressive model completely abandons the vital transfer of accumulated human wisdom. The speakers actually make a really clever comparison here. They compare the ancient prisoners in Plato's cave, who, if you remember, mistake shadows on a wall for absolute reality, to modern youth. They argue that since about 2012, young people have been increasingly isolated, staring endlessly at the glow of a smartphone screen, totally disconnected from the brilliant daylight of real, complex human history. Now, what's really fascinating is how the speakers trace the shift from that classical idea of nourishment, right, into modern political activism. Quoting the sociologist Edward Shills, the source argues that since the student protest movements of the 1960s, a moral obligation to destroy and revolutionize existing societal structures has actually been baked into university teaching. The activists of the 60s, they note, eventually became the professors and curriculum designers of the 90s and beyond. As a result, the guests argue this critical pedagogy categorizes complex human beings into rigid tribal boxes, what they playfully yet very seriously dub the four horsemen of modern ideological critique. They claim this leads to a zombification of thought. Basically, instead of engaging with a rich diversity of complex ideas, students are taught to view every single interaction exclusively through the narrow lenses of oppression and identity politics. And it goes a step further. They argue that failing to teach history objectively has fostered something called oikophobia. According to the speakers, this is a condition where students are essentially conditioned to fear or reject their own home, to view their own prosperous, democratic society as entirely oppressive and evil. By disconnecting students from the achievements of the past, they claim institutions are breeding an active rejection of Western civilization itself. Whether you agree or not, it is a remarkably stark accusation about the modern curriculum. But hey, ideology isn't the only factor at play here. The speakers also take direct aim at the actual institutional and financial engines driving higher education. Mapping out the 1,000-year evolution of the university, they explain how the original requirement to study rhetoric, logic, and human wisdom was slowly dismantled. First, it was replaced by the 19th century German model of hyper-specialized research,
And finally, by the late 20th century model of mass education and corporate managerialism, which completely sidelined the teaching of wisdom.
To put this into perspective, in Australia's massive $40 billion university sector, the source points out a wild statistic. More than half of the 130,000 staff are now managers and bureaucrats, not teachers. They describe this as a bloated, managerial feudalism, entirely obsessed with metrics, while actual classroom teaching is largely undervalued. And driven by a relentless pursuit of profit to fund research prestige, the source notes that 1 in 3 students at Australian universities is now an international student. The speakers argue this creates massive, impersonal mega universities that prioritize revenue over the educational well-being of the students, a shift many recent graduates would probably instantly recognize. Okay, so after completely dissecting the problem, the explainer shifts gears to a rather hopeful solution proposed by the speakers. Channeling the urgency of H.G. Wells, the guests emphasize that addressing this decline isn't just some abstract academic debate. It is an absolute civilizational necessity. If we don't fix how we educate the next generation, they assert we are rushing headlong toward catastrophe. So what's the fix? They advocate strongly for a return to the classical liberal arts model, like the ones successfully used at St. John's College in the US or Campion College in Australia. This model throws out those massive impersonal lecture halls. Instead, it favors small groups of around 15 students intensely reading the 100 great books of history, philosophy, and literature to build really robust, complex analytical skills. To actually fix the system, the speakers recommend some profound philanthropic and policy shifts. They suggest redirecting funds away from giant corporatized university buildings and towards scaling these intimate, intensive reading programs nationwide. By focusing on rigorous reading over fleeting technological fads, they believe we can restore humanitas, a deeper, shared understanding of humanity. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to take away from the source material. As we look at plummeting literacy, student disengagement, and deeply polarized campuses, to save modern education from catastrophe, do we simply need to rediscover the profound wisdom they argue has been quietly sitting on our bookshelves all along? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning, keep learning.